Claire drove her old car up the overgrown driveway. The tires crunched on the gravel and the car's engine sputtered as it climbed the steep incline. She glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing the town below growing smaller and smaller, swallowed by the dense forest. The house loomed before her, dark and imposing. Its tall, narrow windows seemed to watch her approach, and the gabled roof cast long shadows in the dim light. The structure was a relic of a bygone era, standing defiantly against the encroaching wilderness. Rain lashed down, blurring the outlines of the forest surrounding the property. The downpour was relentless, turning the driveway into a muddy path and making the trees sway ominously. The sound of the rain hitting the car roof was deafening, a constant reminder of the storm's fury. It was a dark and stormy night. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the twisted branches of the trees for a split second before plunging everything back into darkness. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her. The perfect night for a haunting. The moon occasionally peeked through the storm clouds, casting an eerie glow on the landscape. The combination of the storm and the moonlight created an otherworldly atmosphere, as if the house and its surroundings were part of a different realm. Claire shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. The cold rain soaked through the fabric, chilling her to the bone. She could feel the wind biting at her skin, and her breath came out in visible puffs of steam. She had never felt so alone and vulnerable. She had bought the old Victorian house for a steal. The price had been unbelievably low, almost too good to be true. The real estate agent had been eager to close the deal, and Claire had jumped at the opportunity, dreaming of restoring the house to its former glory. It had been empty for years, but it was perfect for her, or so she thought. The house had a certain charm, a sense of history that spoke to her. She imagined the stories it could tell, the lives that had been lived within its walls. But now, standing before it, she couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The house stood on a hill overlooking the small town. From this vantage point, she could see the twinkling lights of the houses below, a stark contrast to the darkness surrounding her. The town seemed so far away, a distant memory of warmth and safety. It was isolated, with the forest encroaching on three sides. The trees seemed to close in around the house, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse, offering privacy but also a sense of being cut off from the world. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the porch sagged slightly. The neglect was evident, with vines creeping up the walls and the paint peeling off in large patches. The house had an air of abandonment, as if it had been forgotten by time. Claire took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The rain immediately soaked her, and she could feel the cold water seeping into her shoes. She hesitated for a moment, looking up at the house before steeling herself and moving forward. The air was heavy with moisture and the scent of pine needles. The mist hung low, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. The raindrops clung to the pine needles, glistening like tiny jewels in the dim light. The forest seemed alive, whispering secrets in the wind. As she struggled to get her suitcase out of the trunk, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around nervously, her eyes scanning the darkened forest. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches made her heart race. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling persisted. She finally managed to get her suitcase free and lugged it up the creaking steps. Each step groaned under her weight, adding to the eerie atmosphere. She could feel the wood bending slightly, and she hoped the porch would hold. The house seemed to be testing her resolve. The front door groaned as she pushed it open. The sound echoed through the empty house, a long, drawn-out creak that sent shivers down her spine. The door was heavy, and it took all her strength to push it open. She stepped inside, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on her. The air inside was stale and dusty, heavy with the silence of years. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. The house had a musty smell, a mix of old wood and decay. It was as if time had stood still within these walls. Claire stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness seemed to close in around her, and she fumbled for the light switch. When she finally found it, the light flickered on, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She was alone. Or was she? The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Every creak, every whisper of the wind made her jump. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone, that the house was watching her, waiting for her next move. Claire flicked on the light switch in the hallway. The switch felt cold and stiff under her fingers, as if it hadn't been used in years. The hallway was long and narrow, stretching out before her like a tunnel into the unknown. The bulb flickered for a moment before casting a dim yellow glow over the dusty furniture. The light was weak, barely enough to pierce the thick shadows that clung to the corners of the room. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the feeble glow. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and the air was thick with the smell of dampness. The walls were covered in a thin layer of grime, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. It was as if the house itself was groaning in protest at her presence. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. The house was freezing. The cold seemed to seep into her bones, making her teeth chatter. She could see her breath in the air, a ghostly mist that hung in front of her face. She wandered through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Each step seemed to reverberate through the empty rooms, amplifying the sense of isolation. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on her like a physical weight. The rooms were large and airy, with high ceilings and tall windows, but the windows were covered in a thick layer of dust, blocking out most of the light. The once grand rooms now felt like tombs, filled with the ghosts of the past, but the furniture was old and faded, and the wallpaper was peeling off the walls. The patterns on the wallpaper were barely visible, obscured by years of neglect. The furniture was covered in dust, the fabric worn and threadbare. It was clear that no one had lived here for a very long time. The house had an air of abandonment, as if it had been forgotten by the world. The silence was almost tangible, a living thing that wrapped around her like a shroud. As she explored, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made her jump. She felt eyes on her, unseen but ever present. Every time she turned a corner, she expected to see someone standing there. Her heart pounded in her chest and her palms were slick with sweat. But each time she was met with only emptiness, but the house remained stubbornly empty. The rooms were devoid of life, filled only with shadows and silence. The emptiness was almost mocking, as if the house was playing a cruel joke on her. She told herself it was just her imagination. She tried to calm her racing heart, to convince herself that there was nothing to fear, but the feeling of being watched persisted, gnawing at the edges of her mind. After all, she was alone in a big, old house. The house was ancient, filled with the memories of those who had lived there before. It was only natural to feel a little uneasy in such a place. It was only natural to feel a little uneasy. The house was full of shadows, and the silence was almost deafening. Every sound seemed amplified, every creak and groan a potential threat. But deep down she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a sense of foreboding in the air, a feeling that something terrible had happened here. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. This house held secrets. She could feel it. The walls seemed to whisper to her, telling her stories of the past. She could almost hear the echoes of voices, the laughter and tears of those who had lived here before, and she had a feeling those secrets were about to be revealed. She felt a strange compulsion to keep exploring, to uncover the mysteries that the house held. She knew that she was on the brink of discovering something important, something that would change everything. That night, Claire lay in bed, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite grasp. She listened to the storm raging outside, the wind howling like a wild beast. The wind howled around the house, rattling the windows in their frames, making the entire structure seem alive. Rain beat against the glass like 1,000 tiny fingers, each drop a reminder of the chaos outside. She pulled the covers up to her chin, trying to block out the sound, seeking comfort in the familiar warmth of her bed. But there was another sound that was keeping her awake, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was a soft sound, almost inaudible at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, a shuffling sound, like footsteps just outside her bedroom door, growing more distinct with each passing second. Claire held her breath, listening intently, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. The sound came again, a little louder this time, more deliberate, more menacing. It definitely sounded like footsteps, the kind that sent chills down her spine. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with possibilities. Who could be walking around the house at this hour? She was all alone, wasn't she? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She considered calling out, but her voice caught in her throat, fear paralyzing her vocal cords. What if it was an intruder? The footsteps stopped, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Claire held her breath, waiting. Silence. The kind of silence that makes you question your own sanity. Maybe it was just the wind, she told herself, or the house settling. Old houses made all sorts of noises, didn't they? Old houses made all sorts of noises, she reminded herself, trying to rationalize the fear that gripped her. She lay back down, trying to calm her racing heart, telling herself it was all in her head. But she didn't sleep for the rest of the night, her mind replaying the sound of those footsteps over and over again, each replay more terrifying than the last. She stared at the ceiling, her eyes wide open, every creak and groan of the house amplified in the darkness. She glanced at the clock, the hours dragging by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Her hand clutched the blanket tightly, her knuckles white with tension as she waited for the dawn to break. Finally, the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, bringing with it a sense of relief. Claire sat up in bed, exhausted but relieved, the terror of the night slowly fading with the morning light. She got out of bed, her steps cautious, as if the floor might betray her with another creak. She opened the bedroom door, peering into the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway was empty, bathed in the soft morning light, and she let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She walked down the hallway, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, but finding nothing out of the ordinary. She looked out the window, seeing the calm after the storm, and felt a sense of peace wash over her. A small smile played on her lips, the terror of the night now just a distant memory as she welcomed the new day. The next morning, Claire woke to find the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed in through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She got out of bed and stretched, trying to shake off the memory of the previous night. It had just been her imagination, she told herself. She went to the door and opened it and gasped. There, on the wooden floor just outside her bedroom door, were two muddy footprints. They hadn't been there the night before. Claire stared at the footprints, her blood running cold. How had they gotten there? She was certain she had locked the front door. And there was no sign of forced entry. The only explanation was that someone had been in the house with her, someone who had been walking around while she slept, someone who had left those muddy footprints outside her door. Terror gripped her heart. She was not alone in this house. That night, Claire lay awake in bed, listening. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The footsteps had returned, fainter than before, but undeniably there. They seemed to be coming from the hallway outside her room. Then she saw it. A flicker of movement in the doorway. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, a figure began to emerge from the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, with long, bony fingers. Its clothes were ragged and torn, and its face was hidden in the shadows. Claire watched in horror as the figure took a step closer. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed with fear. The figure paused, as if sensing her gaze. It slowly raised its head, and Claire found herself staring into a pair of hollow black eyes.